Let's do it. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Altmed Podcast. Got Mitch Kurtz on the line, as I always do.
Hello.
Look good. Looking sprightly this hour. It is our pleasure to have the guru of all things GMP and of many other things, actually, which we're about to learn about. It is none other than Trevor Schoerie, who is the Managing Director of Pharmout. Trevor, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, guys. I appreciate the introduction. I'm not too sure if I'm a guru at anything, but I'm really well supported by a great team. So, yeah, no, thank you very much.
And humble to boot.
Yeah, humble to boot, indeed, especially given we know we just learned set up your first facility back in 2001. So, yeah, you've attained the age of 21 years of doing this. So how did you actually get into this space? Because people weren't exactly seeking your assistance, I imagine, back in 2001 to set up medical cannabis facilities, or if they were, maybe, I don't know, they were doing it on the sly. But yeah, how did you get into this space?
It's a really interesting story, I suppose, is that I came across as a supporting spouse as an immigrant. As you can tell, it's not a Queensland accent, so I came from South Africa, and arrived in the country in 2001, and I didn't want to go back into manufacturing. I'm essentially a production cowboy. I'm a qualified production manager, and that's really my background. So I look at costs and efficiencies and etc. That's inherent in what I do. And in 2001, I didn't want to go into manufacturing. It's a difficult game, and I wanted to do something different. So joined a small engineering company, and my first job there was to set up and successfully get a GMP manufacturing license for that company. Back in the 2002 or 2003 sometime. It was a very long time ago now. And then in 2006 decided to start out Pharmout as a consulting company in GMP validation and all things around the manufacturing side of medicines or medicinal products. And that's kind of like my background and how I got into GMP.
So what is, it does, for some of our listeners, I think they've been hearing for a little time now that all Australian medicinal cannabis products that will be supplied in Australia from 1 July next year must be manufactured to a GMP standard. Some people equate this as being of a higher quality, but what would you say if somebody said at the bare basics, what does GMP mean?
Well, I can do fairly flippant and sort of say get more paper, because whatever you do has to be recorded. But I think for me, GMP is the quality standard. So you see throughout history, people have unfortunately passed away through dodgy medicines or snake oils, and the regulator comes in and says, okay, well, we can't have that because it's public opinion to control. So nobody likes a family member passing away. So public opinion actually demands that the regulator does something. And we've seen that sort of with thalidomide, back in the old vaccines. We've seen that reaction as back in the early 1900s, where GMPs originated from, and they accelerated over the years. And we've seen with the relevant to the cannabis industry is the vitamin E acetate in vaping products. I think there will be regulatory action at some stage to control that as well, and standards that will come in. And to a certain extent, that's what GMP is all about, is setting in those common sense controls and tips, I suppose, of how to run a manufacturing facility to control it and make safe and effective medicines. And I think that's really, for me, the key part of that. And as I've got older, I've realized that I can't go and make all the mistakes myself. So if someone gives me a tip as in what is in the GMP documents, and I adopt that, I sort of start thinking of GMPs as gross mistake prevention, guidance, I suppose as well. So talking specifically to your the GMPs, it's GMPs are applicable to all medicines that are manufactured around the world, and every country would have some form of GMP in place. But more particularly, I think with the GMPs that we're talking about now, it's leveling of the playing field, whereas Australian manufacturers have to comply with this GMP standard, and the overseas companies were permitted through a bit of an aberration in the law, were allowed to bring in overseas product that was not manufactured to GMP. And the regulator's job, as I mentioned, is to protect the public health, and therefore they just want to be careful to make sure that we're protecting, well, our relatives, I suppose, and ourselves. It's not some arbitrary person down the road.
Yeah, it's interesting when we're talking about GMP. As you said, there's different different countries have, I guess, different standards of GMP. You didn't actually say that, but I'm saying that. How do we equate or compare? I know that there's such a thing as a mutual recognition agreement, depending on which countries you belong to. Can you talk us through a little bit about, what if something's GMP in say, South Africa or, different parts of Africa, that process and the equivalent standards and whether that would be accepted in Australia, for example?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because we often hear people saying the EU GMP and holding that out as a gold standard, and even heard Professor Schoerie at times sort of talking about the Australian GMPs being a gold standard. Essentially, I think in my mind it relates to the documentation that you follow, the standards, the GMP guidelines, and the regulatory framework that's around that. Essentially, there's been lots of harmonization around countries trying to have equivalence on GMP standards, and this organization that's formed, which is an association or a country club of regulators, if you think of it like that, is called PRCS or PICS. And this is building up mutual confidence in each other, in other regulatory agencies. So South Africa, for example, the SAHPRA, the authority there, the equivalent to TGA or FDA or MHRA, is a PRCS member. And therefore, if they certify a manufacturer in their country, and it's really important to understand it's in their country, that would be most likely be accepted by, say, an Australian or other PICS member, and there are 54 PICS members as we speak right now. But it's really important to understand that the PICS authority is in country, and it's a voluntary acceptance of the other country's GMP certification.
So it's not necessarily whoever's on that list can do free trade between each other type situation.
Well, I think that's not a free trade. It's just one of the planks that you've got to get in terms of your approach to market. So with normal pharmaceuticals, if I got somebody in China, or maybe somebody in, say, Hong Kong, a manufacturer in Hong Kong as a PRCS member, because their regulatory authority has been certified by PICS and they've gone through the accession process, they would manufacture in there, would have much quicker and better access to Australia. So they would probably not need to go through an audit by a TGA inspector, jumping on the plane, scheduling that, and that could delay, in practicality, that could delay anything between 6 and 2 years to get access to the Australian market. If you were, say, in a Chinese manufacturer trying to get into Australia, whereas a Hong Kong-based manufacturer arguably could get into Australia much faster through the there's an overseas process to go through, so it's much quicker and much cheaper. The privilege of having a TGA inspector in China will probably cost you, I'm guessing now, and my numbers are roughly from memory, but it'll be between $40,000 and $60,000 to go through that GMP inspection, whereas the overseas clearance process through another PICS member country is a lot quicker.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you hear about, as you said, EU GMP a lot, and flying German, basically, I guess TGA audited equivalents. I'm not actually sure what the TGA equivalent in Germany is. You would know better than I, but flying them out to different countries, say in South America, to validate the facilities there. Would that be something that an Australian the TGA would accept as a quality standard in a country that has been at a facility in a country that maybe isn't part of the PICS guide or a PICS member, but has had an EU GMP auditor tick off on?
Yes, that's a really good question. So I think, and you alluded to in your earlier question around the mutual recognition agreement. So these are government-to-government agreements, which is different to the PICS framework, which is regulatory agency to regulatory agency agreement, and mutual confidence building in each other's capacity, because the TGA can't go out and inspect every single manufacturing facility in the world, and it makes great sense to do this. So if you have a mutual recognition agreement between, and these are in place, for example, between Australia and Singapore, there would be no need to have an inspection, because the Singaporean inspectorate, the HSA, would be equivalent to the Australian, and similarly the whole of Europe basically would be equivalent through mutual recognition agreements, as well as Canada as well. So,
and funnily enough, not USA, is that correct?
So USA is a PICS member, but they're not. There's no MRA. With active pharmaceutical agreements, there is some collaboration and confidence building going on at the moment. But the US FDA, if I can say, a little bit reluctant to just automatically accept other people's inspection reports. So
I would have thought it would have been the other way around from Australia's perspective in terms of the quality of things that sometimes gets produced in the USA.
I think the TGA, and I think this is mutual respect. The TGA is one of the leading GMP inspectorates around the world, without doubt. I mean, similarly, the FDA and the MHRA would be up there as some of the most respected agencies in the world. It's certainly in my mind, working in this industry for the 20-some or more than 20 years now. But yeah.
And I have a question about TGO 93, because you'll cast your mind back 5 years ago, say, when Australia first harmonized Commonwealth laws to allow states to provide access to medicinal cannabis. They sort of imposed a bare minimum requirement on imports, where all products in Australia had to meet this quality and safety standard, which was TGO 93. Of course, that's what has been recently amended to say that effectively all imports need to meet a GMP equivalent requirement to Australia from 1 July next year. Just interested in your thoughts on what is it about TGO 93 that doesn't go far enough in terms of a quality standard? Or maybe that's an assumption on my part, and you actually think that TGO 93 is a reasonable quality and safety standard.
I think that because of the history of cannabis or medicinal cannabis, it's that there's no pharmacopoeial standard for it. I mean, I know in the US there is for drobanol, which is a synthetically derived THC, but there is no specification, if you want to call it, or pharmacopoeia for cannabis, and there's 23 or 24 pharmacopoeias around the world. So to my knowledge, not one of them actually deals with herbal cannabis medicinal product as such. So how did the TGA then set a quality specification to have some quality standard of the imported product? And dealing with a lot of people that perhaps are not that experienced with pharmaceuticals, they felt that they needed to bring out this therapeutic goods order, or TGO, and they laid out a minimum standard. But if you read that guidance, there's lots of hooks back out to European pharmacopoeias, for example, or EPs as we call them. So when you bring in a normal drug substance, the active ingredient would probably, and the excipients would need to comply with a pharmacopoeia of some sorts. And the default standards we have would be the European pharmacopoeia, the United States pharmacopoeia, or the British pharmacopoeia. And these are default standards that are applicable, and the TGO 93 was just making people aware of these standards.
In a sense, so essentially that earlier quality and safety standard, which included things like any product supplied in Australia must not have above a certain threshold of pesticides and foreign matter and ash and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Like ochratoxin. I'm just interested. I mean, one of the challenges is that through this amended TGO 93, a lot of the countries from which imports possibly were coming in from weren't required to meet a GMP requirement. So in effect, we're imposing an Australian manufacturing standard on a foreign jurisdiction. Do you share that view, or what's your take on that proposition?
Well, arguably, if you look at, say, the German pharmacopoeia, there are some tighter specifications in there for flour, for example. It's it's a much tighter specification than the Australian specification. So there is some work going on at the moment in terms of harmonizing an international monograph or pharmacopoeial standard for cannabis flowers, CBD, THC, etc. So these are all in play at the moment. Arguably, the regulator's taking quite a long time to react to this, but I think what they're doing is they're monitoring the situation and trying to gather information to start putting this into these monographs. So when you look at microbial standards, when we look at, say, tobacco, there's lots of bacteria and fungi that would be in the bacteria because it's a natural derived product. Is that acceptable to have those micro levels in a cannabis or medicinal cannabis product, which arguably could be given to an immune compromised patient? So we sort of look at that from it's not giving tobacco to people, it's actually giving to healthy patients. It's this safety of the, so aflatoxin and orchotoxin, there was good reason to maybe consider those. Heavy metals is the other one. It's interesting, we're doing some work in terms of growing outdoor, how the soils would impact on the heavy metal limits. And California, for example, in the adult market, there will be a limit for heavy metal limits in cannabis as well. There's no daylight between them. Canadian recreational market, there's a limit on orchotoxins and heavy metals as well. So there's not that much difference between the adult use and medical markets in terms of a lot of these specifications. I won't say all of them, but a lot of them.
Yeah, it's actually the more I think about it, I mean, I thought I was under the impression, and again, you'll know better than I, but the Australian restrictions on the certain micrograms of what was allowed in let's say vaporizable flour was actually more stringent than the German requirements.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There are some differences between the two. Micro is an interesting one. You kind of like want to set a specification that's aligned with the process capability, if you want to call it that. So you can't set a specification that's so low that no one on the planet's ever going to be able to meet that specification. So you've got to understand what is the industry process capability. And then you also have to have the long-term in-human health studies to say, well, if someone is getting that many micrograms or nanograms of chromium, what's that going to do to a patient? We just don't have that data yet. So the regulator's busy trying to collect that data at the moment.
Well, it's one of the reasons, I guess, that we pretty much only see irradiated flour in Australia, because it needs to meet, I guess, these. It seems interesting. It almost feels as though Australian industry is asking for the regulations to come into place to level the playing field, let's say GMP, put it across the board, but at the same time loosen it up as much as we can, because we want the stringent protocol to be achievable, because the current settings are quite difficult to meet, in what's otherwise a botanical product.
Yeah, they are tough. They're tough specifications, but there's a lot of so it is very doable. And I don't know if I'd like my family members who would get critically ill and would want or need to have some medicinal cannabis. I don't know if they would want them to start having cadmium or other of these heavy metals, or start having aspergillus, which is a respiratory sort of problem for people inhaling that product. So I'd want some controls around that.
No, I
Sure.
totally take your point. I guess I want to take our conversation in a different direction now. I know you've done a lot of consulting work in helping with the architecture, the engineering, the design of GMP facilities in Australia. We won't have to mention any of your clients' names, but I'm just interested if you can give some, I guess, high level guidance on, somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, Trevor, got this great idea. Me and some friends, we want to cultivate cannabis and, manufacture it into some CBD oil. My family's got some land somewhere and we're going to build a shed on there." What's your tips?
That was my next question. You stole it straight out of my mouth.
Don't argue, guys. It's a really good question, because we're still getting 2 or 3 inquiries a week, and all over the world. And for example, on Monday we got 2 from South Africa, for example, and we're working and have done projects in all over the place in terms of Jamaica, South Africa, Zimbabwe, into Africa, New Zealand, obviously Australia. Some noise coming from Thailand at the moment, or that's been on and off for a while, but their regulatory framework is just hemp at the moment. But when someone comes and starts talking to me about having a facility in Australia, one of my biggest problems is if they got a family farm that they want to grow it on. Any agricultural crop, there's a place in the world where it will be best suited. For example, you want to try to do bananas in Melbourne. It's not you can grow them, but they're not going to be done economically.
I tried.
So how do you set your
really bad.
and you can do them. You can do them, but they're going to be really slow. And there's definitely also different parts of the world will give you different flavors. When I travel into Africa, I love eating the fruit there because it tastes different to the Australian fruit. Probably a little bit more organically grown, I suppose. It helps those secondary metabolites, and cannabis is no different to that. So we look at it in terms of the big sort of costs around setting up a facility. So you've got the infrastructure cost, and if I want to pour 100 mil slab in Portugal, cash in hand, is probably going to be about $50. If I want to do the same slab in South Africa, a bricklayer works and it's morally corrupt, but this is the cost of someone, and this is the competitiveness of the world environment. A bricklayer in South Africa is 35 Rand an hour, which is about $3 an hour. So, we talk about minimum wages here. It's, morally and ethically completely wrong, but this is the environment we find ourselves in. So the infrastructure costs, Australia is very expensive. Then you look at energy or electricity costs, and if you're doing indoor grow with light and not using the free sun, you're going to pay quite a substantial amount for your energy, and that's set to double. And I think, as you guys know, cannabis is not really a green crop as everybody thinks it is. And I think with the recent elections, I think we're all acutely aware that the Australian appetite for energy wasting is probably not going to be as high as it should be. And then the last one is the direct labor cost. It's fairly labor intensive to trim flowers and to work through the flowers, and as you're harvesting and tending to the plants, it's fairly labor intensive. So other economies, emerging economies, it's much cheaper to do it there. So then you have to look at, well, how you're going to be competitive. And often when I go to sites before COVID, when we could still travel, I'd go out to sites and actually stand on the site and say, right, now what's the competitive advantage of this site versus, say, Australia or New Zealand?
Interesting. And I think, we might even save you a few inquiries and some time by asking you straight off the bat. What is, say, somebody comes along, as Andrew said, with a bit of land, and got dad's farm, and I want to put up this grow. We're already doing capsicums, whatever it is. What kind of cost is somebody looking at, just at a very, very high level to get started?
I think we covered. So it's $3 an hour for the bricklayer. I'm doing it in Joburg, or
Yeah, so definitely you need to, any agricultural crop, if you can be closer to the environment where it's conducive, that's the best. We've sort of pivoted to, we've been through the complete indoor Canadian style grow. That's quite expensive to run unless you get free or cheap and electrical energy. We've gone through to complete outdoor grow, which is obviously you save money on the cultivation costs, but then your head house costs become substantially higher because you have this avalanche of product, or when North Americans call it Croptober, and in October or Southern Hemisphere in around March, you get this avalanche of product arriving to be processed. So you're going to spend more money on that building to do all your post-harvest processing activities. But the short answer to kind of like what you need, we used to say about $4 million. At the moment, we're sitting at around $10 million. So if you don't have $10 million in the bank, don't even try to do this. And you can see the difficulty of, say, the listed companies in Australia trying to get to profit. It's been a struggle, and even the North American, Canadian companies, they've been struggling to get to profit. So it's a lot of investment in a market where there's a lot of uncertainty and regulatory oversight and burden.
Is that a cost or a price tag that attaches just to the infrastructure, or is that sort of for the first, sort of couple of years of operation?
3 to 5 years type of situation?
Yeah, it definitely is. There's some startup cost. The ODC licensing process probably takes a year at the moment, and most people want to get an ODC license on that land before they start building stuff, and that means that you still got to through the planning process, and then probably another 12 months after that. So you got 2 or 3 years to fund quite a few people that are sitting around not doing a lot of productive or output as such, or revenue earning activities. And then you've got to start up, and it takes you quite some time to get your genetics settled down. And of course, you once you've got your product, you have to have an expiry or a shelf life on your product as well. So you've got to have stability work done on your product and your packaging system and closure system. So you're probably looking at another 6 months to do that as well. So my advice is always to start small and then grow and get bigger, and you learn your competence. So the GMPs tell us that when you employ staff, you need to have a combination of education, experience, and training to be competent to do your job. The problem with the cannabis industry is you can't find people who are experienced at doing cannabis at scale. So we often go to ornamental growers or plant growers and transition them into growing cannabis. But you don't easily, or there are qualifications being issued now around education that you can do a degree. I think the US universities are now starting to offer them for cannabis. And then the last one is getting the experience. And not many people have 5 years of experience in growing a cannabis facility at scale. And this is where GMPs are helpful, because you can get procedures, policies, work instructions, cheat sheets, reminders, etc. at point of use, or where people need them to tell them how to do something. And so the documented procedures are helpful to your staff.
I've got a very a question around GMP. We hear a few different acronyms thrown around, and I think I know what they all mean, but it's always good to get the opinion of somebody who knows more. But the difference between GMP, CGMP, GACP, GAP, I think I know what they mean, but I'd love to hear you school me.
or even throw in GXP, which is the mathematical equation for the middle part of that. So GLP, good laboratory practice, good clinical practice, and so it goes on. So it's a really interesting part around the CGMPs are more of an Americanism. So they like to talk about current good manufacturing practice. But essentially, good manufacturing practice is good manufacturing practice. And if you compliant with the American requirements, there's few subtleties or PICs or EU GMP GMP in broad terms is word for word the same. There's no discernible difference. There will be some slight idiosyncrasies here and there, but yeah, there's no real difference. In broad terms, the GAP is sort of a more of an American term for, the European term for good agricultural practice, and the good agricultural and collection practice, or GACP, is more of a World Health Organization term. But these cultivation systems that control the collection of plant material, cultivation and collection of plant materials, falls under the GACP, as we call it. And then the GMP is typically where you start coming into post-harvest. So most manufacturing processes will be when you start drying. And especially if you're starting to do a flower, that's when GMP will step in. So what we're trying to do with these layers of an onion is, as such, is that between the patient and the processing activities, if you going ahead and doing extraction and say isolate, making isolates, you've got more processing steps between your manufacturing process and the patient. So the GMP line sort of shifts away. So if you're doing extraction and isolates, you don't have to grow your product under GACP or do the early drying under GMP, for example. So that line does shift a little bit, and that's probably we got ex-GMP auditors in the office, and we've had some active debates around exactly where the GMP line is. But
we have those same debates, actually.
Yeah. So it's people that have got 10 plus years experience in this industry as GMP inspectors will have some debate as to exactly where the GMP line should be.
My understanding was that if you're going to further extract or manufacture, you could even have non-GMP first order extraction.
That's right. Yeah, the initial instructions. That's what the code says.
So like a crude oil, you could essentially have non-GMP, bring that in. And then if it's not presented to the patient in that form, it's further manufactured, then it's everything after that needs to be GMP.
Especially if you're turning that into an isolate. So the problem we have when we set up manufacturing facilities for people, they don't often know what product they're going to supply to the market. So we would set up somebody to do isolate manufacture, but then they'll start selling flowers because that's lucrative. And the whole GMP of their facility suddenly changes. So the fabric of the and the hygienic practices that they need to apply would then to be full GMP. And so we tend to say to customers that if they're going to do any post-harvest processing, we kind of like want them to adopt GMP facility design. So that's where architects come in and talk through, what the fabric of the building should be. And that's not too, it's not over the top. It's just cove floors and looks like a hospital theatre, clean and hygienic. And it's probably what you'd want with any product that you're consuming, and it's not a massive on cost. And the air quality has to be clean as well, so you're not contributing microbes, etc., to the product. And also people are gowned correctly, so they're using gloves and hair nets and stuff. You don't want hair falling into your product and opening up your product and there's Lucy's hair waiting for you. You kind of like don't. That's not
nice, me. Andrew likes that, but not me.
It's a personal preference. But no, I just I wanted to ask about that. I guess the extent of sterility in a fully GMP facility. Is it the case that you have things like air, air conditioning in the sense of it actually purifies air, and similarly for water, any water that's used on site? Are these sort of steps that go further than what is required, or is that sort of, par for the course?
Yeah, so as you start getting into the later processing area, the product contact surfaces need to be clean and hygienic, and be not contributing or particulate shedding towards the product as well. So product surfaces need to be cleaned with potable water, at least in the early stages, and then you have to use purified water if you're doing rinsing out of any surfaces. So there are some processes that would be required. But generally speaking, you can't, like in the early stages of flower manufacturing or cultivating and harvesting and processing the flower, you would have that through an F7 filter, which is the minimum requirement. And you'll have a few air changes to keep that free of any pathogens. As you can imagine, you're bringing in a botanically derived product into a controlled space. And as those fungi, for example, are dying, they'll give off spore, or bacteria would give off spore, and that potentially have residual bacteria floating around the air. And hence you've got to gown your operators and protect them from that as well. Once you've irradiated the product, we step up that hygienic practices almost to what we would call a grade C type practice, because once you've done the irradiation, there is no micro there. You want to keep it that way. So you'll adopt a much higher level of gowning, so no outside street clothing will go into those areas. You'd have very strict controls around you don't blow your nose and go back to packing out cannabis flower, for example. So those are sort of just general hygiene practices.
Yeah. I have one more question. That is interesting. Yeah, I do know from memory being on some of the farms, changing the jacket, stepping on the chemical pad, making sure that all happens. I do have one other question though that I'm very curious to get your perspective on. You know, sometimes you'll hear about GMP and you'll be talking to someone and they say, oh, what standard of GMP? Is it pharmaceutical GMP? Is it food grade GMP? Is it cosmetic GMP? And so, for example, if somebody wanted to bring a food grade GMP CBD oil into Australia, that obviously wouldn't stack as of July 1st next year, correct?
Yeah.
And
so,
yeah.
Yep.
Why is that the case? What separates those two?
Well, I think the basic premise of GMP is you can't test in quality. So you have to have systems that controls the quality, and it's quality through design. And what I mean by that is that, say your cadmium, which is a heavy metal contaminant, that will probably be coming through on your media or your fertilizers, your DAP, for example, might be laced with cadmium. And so your GMP lines go all the way back into the grow media or the fertigations, that the rock salts that you use. So where do you control those? So you need some design controls that make sure that you don't introduce these heavy metals or pathogens into your process. And so the GMP is not just testing at the end, it's almost too late. So these practices are around the control. So you might miss heavy metals, for example, or micro contaminants, and that could potentially cause harm to your patient. So you're trying to protect your patient.
Yeah, because my question around that was always the difference between, you know, if you're talking about, say, a tincture oil or something of that nature, you've got what would be considered food GMP versus pharmaceutical GMP. And food GMP, you'd imagine, is a standard for ingestible products, which you're ending up having the same, you're using it in the same way. So you'd have to imagine it's got to be to a certain standard that would be safe to ingest. And as such, why is the extra step of pharmaceutical necessary in that situation?
I think the big difference is that it's administered to a patient that has possibly a compromised immune system, and that once you start doing your risk assessments as to why you should release this batch, you have to have that patient, the worst case patient, or worst case example and patient in your head, and that's why you're allowed to release the batch. But don't get me wrong, you know, some of the work I've done in New Zealand, for example, with the dairy industry, some of their food practices would make the pharmaceutical industry look a bit shabby in terms of going out and verifying that all that milk that's been taken from the cows that day is being pasteurized properly. And they have a quite a rigorous system of verifying to make sure that that food's safe. And you grab your milk, for example, it's got an expiry of maybe 2 or 3 weeks, but quite often it lasts a lot longer than that because their hygienic practices are really good. So there's a lot we can learn from the food industry or cosmetics industry, but this is a medicine and we're choosing to treat as a medicine, and therefore all the medicinal standards come into play.
Yep.
It is important to stress that the GMPs are the same whether you're doing a sunscreen or a injectable product. Very loosely, there's an Annex 1 or there's a extra guidance for sterile or aseptically processed products, but largely your part 1 and part 2 are identical. So you've got to do your risk assessment to say how tough and how hard you're going to be, and on your application and adoption of your GMPs. So pharmaceuticals, you can ramp it up or down as much as you want to, in a sense. Obviously, you've got to justify that to internally to your experienced staff and to the regulator as well.
Well, that's very, very interesting. I did not realize that about New Zealand, but it explains why they have such a popular export market of dairy products and powder to Asian markets. We know you're a busy man, Trevor, so we'll wrap it up there. But I just, you are a true wealth of knowledge on this topic, and we are very grateful for your time. I've sort of can see Mitch has got that look in his eyes where he could almost go on for another 8 hours of
I'm intrigued
questions, but it could be deemed interrogation. But no, we're very grateful for your time. So thanks so much for joining us. And look, when Mitch and I come into possession of a nice big vacant block of land, we'll be sure to catch up with you professionally, so you can tell us don't do it. Bad idea.
Your dad's backyard is a good 30 meters squared, Andrew, I think.
Yeah, totally. right next to the ocean. Really good soil quality.
You can do an OG strain.
Yeah. Indica though at this latitude, Andrew.
Yeah. It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much, Trevor.
Thank you both. I thoroughly enjoyed helping and trying to give back a little bit to the industry. It's been very generous to me. So thank you.
We appreciate it, and I'm sure our listeners do as well. So thank you so much for being with us for the last hour. Thanks, Trevor.
Thanks very much. Cheers.
All right,
okay, bye.
Take care.